November 1956. British paratroopers are dropping into Port Said, Egypt. Warships from the Royal Navy sit off the coast of the Suez Canal, that artery that once made the British Empire the largest the world had ever seen. For a few days, it looks like the old empire is flexing one last time, the way it always had, for 200 years. Then, the phone calls start coming from Washington. Within a week, the operation collapses. Sterling is in freefall, and Prime Minister Anthony Eden is a broken man. This is the story most people know. The British Empire, we're told, died at Suez, humiliated by the Americans, exposed as a paper tiger, forced to accept that the sun really was setting on an empire that once covered a quarter of the map. It's a clean story, a single villain, a single humiliation, a single turning point. It's the version taught in classrooms and repeated in documentaries, and it is almost entirely the wrong story. Let me show you why. Suez didn't kill the British Empire. Suez was the funeral, not the murder. By the time those paratroopers hit the ground in 1956, the empire's financial spine had already been broken for the better part of 3 decades. And almost nobody watching the news that week understood why. The real story isn't about tanks or canals at all. It's about ledgers, gold reserves, and a handful of monetary decisions made in quiet rooms in London and Washington. Long before anyone had ever heard of Gamal Abdel Nasser, the empire didn't fall in 1956. It had already been bled dry, one balance sheet at a time. And Suez simply forced Britain to admit out loud what its own treasury had known for years. I want you to sit with that for a moment, because what I'm about to show you will completely change how you understand not just the British Empire, but how all great powers actually fall. Suez wasn't the cause, it was the final symptom, the last gasp of a patient that had been dying for 3 decades. And the doctor who administered the first fatal dose was Winston Churchill. To understand how an empire that ruled a quarter of humanity could be brought to its knees by a currency crisis, we have to go back nearly 40 years before Suez, to a decision made in 1925, in the wood-paneled offices of the British Treasury, by a man who is remembered today mostly for a war he hadn't yet fought. His name was Winston Churchill, and in 1925, he wasn't a wartime leader. He was Chancellor of the Exchequer, and he was about to make what the economist John Maynard Keynes would call one of the great monetary blunders of the 20th century. Churchill was a man of enormous gifts. He could write like an angel, speak like a prophet, and command a room like no one else of his generation. But he was not an economist, and he had a fatal weakness. He believed that financial prestige was more important than economic reality. He believed that the pound sterling, at its pre-war value, represented British greatness, and he was willing to sacrifice almost anything to preserve that symbol. In April 1925, against the advice of almost every serious economist in the country, Churchill took Britain back to the gold standard, at the pre-war rate of $4.86 to the pound, a rate that overvalued sterling by roughly 10%, a rate that made British exports drastically more expensive on world markets, at exactly the moment British industry could least afford it. Now you might ask, why would someone so intelligent do something so destructive? The answer is complicated. Part of it was pride. Part of it was a genuine, if misguided, belief that the old order could be restored. And part of it was pressure from the City of London, from bankers who cared more about financial orthodoxy than about the unemployed miners in Wales or the factory workers in Manchester. But whatever the reason, the decision was made, and the consequences were devastating. To understand why Churchill's decision was so catastrophic, we need to understand what the British Empire actually was. Not the maps, not the flags, not the military parades. The empire was a financial machine, and for most of the 19th century, that machine was the most powerful the world had ever seen. It wasn't the army that made the empire invincible. It wasn't even the Navy, impressive as it was. It was the City of London. Sterling was the world's reserve currency, the currency every serious nation held, traded in, and settled its debts in. As the historian Neil Ferguson has written, the empire's dominance rested less on Maxim guns than on invisible earnings. Insurance, shipping, and above all, London's ability to lend money to the entire planet and get paid back in a currency everyone trusted. That trust was the empire's real weapon. When Britain lent money, it lent in sterling. When other nations wanted to trade with the empire, they had to hold sterling. When they wanted to borrow, they had to accept British terms. It was a virtuous cycle. The more the world used sterling, the more powerful the empire became. And the more powerful the empire became, the more the world used sterling. For nearly a century, this system worked beautifully. It made Britain the richest nation on earth. It financed the Industrial Revolution. It built railways across India, plantations in Africa, and trading posts in Asia. But it was also fragile because the entire system rested on one thing: trust. Trust that Britain would honor its debts. Trust that sterling would retain its value. Trust that the empire had the financial strength to back its promises. And that trust took its first serious wound in a war nobody expected to last 4 years. When the First World War began in 1914, Britain assumed it could finance the fight the way it had financed every previous war, by drawing on its enormous stock of overseas investments. Before the war, Britain held roughly $16 billion in foreign securities, a mountain of wealth that seemed inexhaustible. It didn't work that way. The war was too expensive and too long. Artillery shells cost money. Millions of soldiers needed food, clothing, and weapons. The Royal Navy had to be maintained at full strength, and the Germans showed no signs of surrendering. By 1916, Britain was burning through its reserves at an alarming rate. By 1917, it was borrowing from the United States. And by the war's end, the financial landscape had been permanently transformed. Britain was forced to sell off roughly a quarter of its foreign investment holdings. Entire portfolios that had taken decades to build were liquidated in just a few years. And more humiliating still, Britain had to borrow directly from the United States. By the war's end, Britain owed the American government somewhere in the neighborhood of $4.7 billion, a figure that, adjusted for what money meant at the time, represented a genuine transfer of financial power across the Atlantic. The empire that had spent a century as the world's creditor woke up in 1918 as one of the world's largest debtors. That single fact would shape every decision Britain made for the next 30 years. And it meant that Churchill's decision in 1925 was not just a mistake. It was a disaster waiting to happen. Let me explain exactly what Churchill did and why it was so destructive. Before the war, £1 sterling had been fixed to gold at a rate of $4.86. It was a rate that symbolized British financial supremacy. It meant that anyone holding sterling could exchange it for a fixed amount of gold. And because everyone trusted Britain, everyone accepted sterling as good as gold. After the war, with Britain's economy weaker and its export industries battered, the pound's real value had drifted well below that old peg. The British economy had changed. Its industrial base was older, less efficient, and less competitive than it had been in 1914. American and German industry had grown during the war, while Britain had been fighting. British workers were demanding higher wages, and the government was heavily in debt. Almost every serious economist advising the Treasury, including Keynes himself, warned that returning to the pre-war gold rate would overvalue the pound by something like 10%, making British exports drastically more expensive on world markets. At exactly the moment British industry could least afford it, Keynes laid out the case with devastating clarity. He argued that Britain had a choice. It could either return to the gold standard at a realistic rate, or it could accept higher unemployment and industrial decline. Churchill chose the gold standard, and with it, he chose unemployment. The effect was immediate and brutal. British coal, steel, and textile exports, already struggling against American and German competition, became even less competitive. Orders dried up, factories closed, and unemployment in Britain's industrial north climbed into the hundreds of thousands. By 1926, over 1 million workers were out of work. Families that had never known poverty were suddenly hungry. Men who had worked in the same mill for 30 years were told their services were no longer needed. And the miners, already struggling, were told they would have to accept wage cuts. They refused, and the 1926 general strike began, involving well over 1 million workers, shutting down railways, docks, and factories across the country. It was the largest industrial action in British history, and it was in large part a direct consequence of wage cuts forced on industries that could no longer sell their goods abroad at a profit. The strike failed. The miners went back to work on worse terms, but the damage was done. Britain was now a divided nation, and its industrial base was in terminal decline. Britain would stay shackled to this overvalued pound until 1931, when the pressure of the Great Depression finally forced it off gold entirely. But the damage to Britain's industrial base and to its financial credibility was already done. The 1930s were not kind to Britain. While Germany and the United States were rebuilding their industrial capacity, Britain was limping along. Its factories were old, its equipment was outdated, its workforce was demoralized, and its government was obsessed with balancing the budget rather than investing in the future. As the historian Corelli Barnett later argued, the interwar years left Britain with an economy that looked like a great powers on paper, but functioned like a much smaller one underneath. The numbers tell the story. British industrial output grew slower than any other major economy. British exports lost market share every year, and British living standards stagnated while Americans and Germans grew wealthier. By 1939, Britain was a nation that had won a war but lost its economic vitality. And then came a second war, and this one finished what the first had started. When Britain declared war on Germany in September 1939, it was already in a precarious financial position. The debts from the First World War were still being paid. The industrial base was weaker than it had been 20 years earlier, and the empire was already showing signs of strain. By 1941, Britain was effectively bankrupt. Its gold and dollar reserves were nearly exhausted, and it couldn't pay for the war. It was kept alive by the American Lend-Lease program, through which the United States supplied Britain with war materiel, food, and equipment without immediate payment. Over the course of the war, Lend-Lease aid to Britain totaled somewhere north of $30 billion. It saved the country militarily. Without it, Britain would have been forced to sue for peace, but it came at a terrible price. It cemented permanently the shift of financial gravity from London to Washington. The Americans were now the financial backers of the Allied war effort, and they would not forget it. When Allied leaders gathered at Bretton Woods in 1944 to design the post-war financial system, the outcome reflected this new reality with total clarity. The American dollar, not the British pound, would be the anchor of the world economy, tied to gold, with every other currency, including sterling, pegged to it. The British delegation, led by John Maynard Keynes, fought hard for a different system. They wanted a more equitable arrangement, one that would give Britain room to rebuild. But the Americans held all the cards. They had the money, they had the gold, and they had the power. Keynes returned to London a disappointed man. He knew that the empire's financial independence was over, but the full extent of the disaster hadn't yet been revealed. Britain emerged from the Second World War as one of the victorious powers. Yet financially, it had become dependent on the very ally it had once dwarfed economically. In 1946, Britain was forced to negotiate a further American loan, $3.75 billion, at a time when Britain's economy was in ruins. Its cities were bombed, its factories were worn out, its export markets were lost, and its colonies were demanding independence. The loan was a lifeline, but it came with a condition that proved almost immediately disastrous. Britain agreed to make the pound freely convertible into dollars by the summer of 1947. This meant that anyone holding sterling could exchange it for dollars, and then use those dollars to buy American goods. The British government agreed to this because it believed its reserves were sufficient to handle the demand. They were wrong. When convertibility actually arrived in July 1947, the results were catastrophic. Holders of sterling around the world rushed to convert their pounds into dollars. They didn't trust Britain's ability to maintain the peg. They wanted hard currency. They wanted American dollars, and they wanted them now, draining Britain's reserves so fast that the government was forced to suspend convertibility after barely 5 weeks. It was one of the shortest-lived currency experiments in history, and it was deeply humiliating. It showed the world that Britain could no longer control its own currency. It showed that sterling was no longer a reliable store of value, and it showed that the empire's financial foundation was crumbling. After the 1947 convertibility debacle, Britain tried to salvage its currency position. It created the sterling area, a system of countries that agreed to hold their reserves in sterling and to trade with each other in sterling. It was a last-ditch effort to preserve the empire's financial influence, and it worked for a while. British colonies and Commonwealth countries continued to use sterling. India, Pakistan, Australia, New Zealand, and many African nations all held their reserves in London. This gave Britain a buffer. It meant that British banks could lend more than they had in reserves, and it kept the City of London functioning as a financial center. But the cracks were showing. The colonies were demanding independence, and the Commonwealth countries were becoming more independent. In 1947, India gained independence. In 1948, Burma and Ceylon followed. In 1949, Britain devalued the pound against the dollar, a desperate measure to boost exports. By 1950, Britain was no longer the undisputed master of the sterling system, and the problem was about to get worse. By the time Anthony Eden ordered troops into Egypt in 1956, the empire was already in its death throes. The famous moment that history remembers as the death of the British Empire was really just the last domino in a chain that had started falling in 1925. What actually happened during the Suez Crisis wasn't a military defeat. British and French forces, alongside Israel, achieved most of their immediate objectives on the ground. They secured the canal, they defeated the Egyptian army, and they showed that British military power was still formidable. But the financial front was another story. As Britain's military operation dragged on, speculators around the world began selling sterling, betting that Britain's already fragile reserves couldn't withstand a prolonged crisis. The Eisenhower administration was furious. Britain had launched the operation without consulting Washington. The Americans were worried about the effect on the broader Cold War. They didn't want to alienate the Arab world, and they didn't want the Soviets to gain influence in the Middle East. So they made a decision that revealed exactly where real power now sat. The United States blocked emergency support for the pound at the International Monetary Fund, and let it be known that no assistance would come unless Britain withdrew. Britain's gold and dollar reserves, according to Treasury records examined by economic historians, including Barry Eichengreen, fell by hundreds of millions of dollars in a matter of weeks. A hemorrhage the country simply could not sustain. Within days, Eden's government capitulated, agreeing to a ceasefire and full withdrawal, humiliated not by Egyptian resistance, but by the arithmetic of its own reserve account. This was the mechanism, not tanks, not treaties, but the simple fact that Britain no longer controlled the currency its entire empire ran on. The Suez Crisis in 1956 was not an isolated event. It was the culmination of a process that had been unfolding for 30 years. And once the financial foundation was gone, the empire's political and military structure crumbled quickly. Between 1956 and 1968, Britain granted independence to more than 30 colonies. Malaya in 1957, Ghana in 1957, Cyprus in 1960, Nigeria in 1960, Sierra Leone in 1961, Tanganyika in 1961, Jamaica in 1962, Trinidad in 1962, Uganda in 1962, Kenya in 1963, Nyasaland in 1964, Northern Rhodesia in 1964, Gambia in 1965. The list goes on. It was the fastest decolonization in history, and it wasn't because the British suddenly became enlightened. It was because they couldn't afford to keep the empire anymore. The cost of maintaining colonial administrations, military bases, and trade relationships was simply too high, and the British public had lost the will to pay for it. The empire had been a source of pride for generations, but by the 1960s, it had become a burden, a financial drain, a political liability, and a reminder of a greatness that had faded. Let me give you the numbers. By 1956, Britain's post-war debt stood at roughly £27 billion. That's the equivalent of nearly $1 trillion today, a staggering sum for a country that had just been through a war. The cost of maintaining the empire was enormous. The British Army had troops stationed in dozens of countries. The Royal Navy had to patrol shipping lanes across the globe. And the colonial civil service employed thousands of administrators, teachers, and doctors, all of whom had to be paid. By the late 1950s, Britain was spending more on its welfare state at home than on its empire abroad. The priority had shifted. British voters wanted schools and hospitals. They wanted jobs and housing. They didn't want to pay taxes to keep a far-flung empire going. The politicians understood this. They knew that the days of empire were over, and they began to plan for a graceful exit. Sometimes it was graceful, sometimes it wasn't. But the outcome was the same. The British Empire was gone. But let's pause for a moment, because behind all these numbers and all these dates were real people, real families, real lives. Behind the reserve figures and Treasury memos were ordinary people, quietly reshaped by decisions made far above their heads. In the industrial towns of northern England in the late 1920s, families watched fathers and sons laid off from mills and shipyards because British goods had become too expensive to sell abroad. A direct consequence of a currency decision most of them never heard debated. Imagine being a coal miner in Yorkshire. You've worked in the same pit for 20 years. Your father worked there before you. Your son is waiting to start when he turns 16, and then you're told that the mine is closing. Because the government in London has decided to overvalue the pound, and now British coal is too expensive to sell to anyone. Your family is out of work. Your savings are gone, and there's nothing you can do about it. This was the reality for hundreds of thousands of working-class families. Their lives were destroyed by decisions they never understood. Decisions made by men in suits. Men who had never set foot in a mine. Men who had never worked in a mill. And it wasn't just the industrial North. Dock workers in London and Liverpool watched the volume of imperial trade shrink through the 1930s and after the war. Long before anyone used the word decolonization to describe what was happening to them, the docks had been the heart of the empire. Ships from all over the world docked in London, Liverpool, and Glasgow. They brought tea from India, rubber from Malaya, and wool from Australia. They took back machinery, textiles, and manufactured goods. It was a vast, complex system that employed tens of thousands of workers. But the system was already breaking down. The dock workers knew something was wrong. They saw fewer ships. They saw less cargo. They saw their friends and neighbors losing jobs. But they didn't understand why. The answer was hidden in the ledgers of the Treasury, in the balance sheets of the Bank of England. For colonial administrators and their families stationed across Africa and Asia, the post-war years brought a strange, disorienting experience. A sense that the empire they served was somehow still there on the map, still flying the same flag, while the money to sustain it quietly evaporated underneath them. And for British civilians at home, the irony was sharpest of all. Britain had technically won the Second World War, yet its citizens endured food rationing that lasted, in some categories, until 1954. Nearly a decade after victory, a direct consequence of a national balance sheet too strained by war debt and reserve crises to feed its own population without careful control. Meat was rationed, sugar was rationed, bread was rationed, butter was rationed, cheese was rationed. The British people had fought a war to defeat fascism, and they were still living on rations 4 years after peace. Meanwhile, the United States was experiencing an economic boom. American workers had jobs. American families had refrigerators, washing machines, and cars. The contrast was striking, and it bred a deep resentment. British people had won the war, but they were losing the peace. Victory, for millions of ordinary Britons, felt very little like winning. There is a pattern here worth sitting with, because it isn't unique to Britain, and it isn't finished playing out. Empires and great powers rarely collapse the moment their weakness becomes visible. They collapse only once the world's confidence in their currency, their debts, and their promises finally catches up with a reality that had already changed years, sometimes decades earlier. The gap between the moment a power's underlying financial foundation actually cracks and the moment the wider world notices and reacts can be extraordinarily long. Long enough that entire generations live inside it without realizing the ground has already shifted beneath them. Think about that. There are people who live their entire adult lives in the British Empire without knowing it was already dying. They thought the world was still ordered. They thought British power was still secure. They thought the future would be like the past. They were wrong. And the same is true today. Any nation whose global influence rests heavily on the world's willingness to hold its currency, finance its deficits, and trust its promises is running the same experiment Britain ran between 1925 and 1956. Whether or not its leaders would ever put it in those terms, the British Empire's decline was invisible to most people for years. Only after the crash did they understand what had happened. Today's citizens may be living through the same process, and they won't know it until it's over. The pattern is always the same. A great power makes a series of financial decisions. Each one seems small at the time. Each one is justified by experts. Each one is defended by politicians. And then one day, the system just stops. And everyone asks the same question: how did this happen? The answer is always the same. It happened one balance sheet at a time. The speed of the empire's final unraveling is remarkable. Between 1956 and 1960 alone, Britain lost its status as a global power. The Suez Crisis in 1956. The Declaration of Independence by Malaya in 1957. The collapse of the Federation of Rhodesia and Nyasaland. The withdrawal from India. The end of British influence in the Middle East. And by 1960, the empire was gone. All that was left was a small number of colonies and dependencies: Hong Kong, Gibraltar, the Falkland Islands, a few islands in the Caribbean. It was a shadow of what had once been. The process of decolonization accelerated in the 1960s. In 1962, Jamaica gained independence. In 1963, Kenya gained independence. In 1964, Malta gained independence. In 1965, Gambia gained independence. In 1966, British Guiana gained independence. And in 1968, Mauritius gained independence. By 1970, the British Empire was history, and Britain itself was a middle power. No longer a superpower, no longer a world leader, just another European country with a colonial past. Let me tell you where all the money went. It didn't go into the pockets of corrupt officials. It didn't go into lavish palaces. It didn't go into useless projects. It went into debt repayment. Britain spent the decades after World War II paying off its debts. To the United States, to Canada, to private investors, to its own citizens. And every pound that went to debt repayment was a pound that couldn't be invested in the empire, or in British industry, or in British infrastructure, or in British education, or in British healthcare. The empire was sacrificed to the bondholders, and the bondholders were in London, New York, and Washington. The British government made a series of decisions in the 1950s and 1960s. Decisions to prioritize debt repayment over investment. Decisions to prioritize private lenders over public services. Decisions to prioritize short-term solvency over long-term prosperity. And these decisions had consequences. British industry stagnated. British infrastructure decayed. British living standards fell. And the empire was sold off, piece by piece, to pay the bills. This was not a conspiracy. It was not a plot by evil bankers. It was just reality. Britain had borrowed too much money, and it had to pay it back. The empire was the only asset left to sell. What Britain realized in the 1950s was that it could no longer afford to maintain its empire. The cost of maintaining colonial administrations, military bases, and trade relationships was simply too high, and the British public had lost the will to pay for it. The empire had been a source of pride for generations, but by the 1960s, it had become a burden, a financial drain, a political liability, and a reminder of a greatness that had faded. So Britain got out, not gracefully, not quickly, but inevitably. The empire was gone, and the British people had to find a new identity, a new purpose, a new way to be a great nation without being a global power. It wasn't easy, and it still isn't. The wounds of decolonization are still healing, but the process is complete. The British Empire is no more. What was the legacy of this collapse? For Britain, it was a loss of status. A country that once ruled a quarter of the world now struggled to find its place in the world order. It joined the European Economic Community in 1973. It accepted American leadership in the Cold War. It became a middle power. For the world, it was the end of an era. The era of European colonialism. The era of empires. The era of white supremacy. It was replaced by the American-led world order. The order that still exists today. And for history, it was a lesson. A lesson in the fragility of power. A lesson in the importance of financial stability. A lesson that great powers die not with a bang, but with a whimper. The British Empire didn't end at Suez. It ended in 1,000 small decisions, in 1,000 balance sheets, in 1,000 meetings. And nobody outside a few government offices noticed until it was too late. So when people say the British Empire fell at Suez in 1956, humiliated by Nasser and abandoned by Eisenhower, they are describing the funeral and mistaking it for the murder. The empire's true death warrant was signed in 1925 in a quiet Treasury office by a chancellor chasing prestige instead of listening to his own economists. And it was carried out slowly, invisibly, through 2 wars, a failed loan condition, and 30 years of a currency that had already lost the argument long before anyone fired a shot near the canal. Suez didn't end the British Empire. It simply read the empire its own obituary, written decades earlier in ink nobody outside a handful of Treasury officials had ever bothered to read. If this is the first time you've heard the real sequence behind Suez, you're not alone. And it's exactly the kind of story this channel exists to dig up. Subscribe if you want more of history's popular myths taken apart and rebuilt from the ground up. And let us know in the comments which empire's collapse you'd like unpacked next.